On July 23, 1997, federal agents arrested a man at a New York airport. He had just returned from the Cayman Islands. His name was John Spano Jr. He was 32 years old. He was charged with bank fraud, wire fraud, and forgery across 3 states: New York, Massachusetts, and Texas. What he had done, what this particular set of charges represented, was something that had never happened before in the history of professional sports in the United States. He had bought an NHL franchise, a real one, a storied one. The New York Islanders, the team that had won 4 consecutive Stanley Cup championships in the early 1980s, one of the most celebrated dynasties in hockey history. He had sat in boardrooms with NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman. He had been welcomed as the savior of a struggling franchise by a city that desperately wanted one. He had controlled a professional hockey team for 58 days. He had done all of it with less than $100,000 in his bank account. I am not rounding down. Less than $100,000. For a $165 million purchase. This is the story of how. John Spano was born May 31st, 1964 in New York City. He grew up in northeastern Ohio, specifically in and around Ashtabula, a small city on Lake Erie about 60 miles east of Cleveland. According to the podcast Ohio versus the World, which interviewed John Valenti of Newsday, the journalist who led the investigation that ultimately exposed the fraud, Spano played football in Ohio alongside a young man named Urban Meyer, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated college football coaches in American history. Spano did not go on to anything particularly notable in Ohio. He graduated from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh in 1986 with a degree in business administration. He moved to Texas. He started a company, or several, depending on which version of his biography you believed, in the early 1990s. And somewhere in the process of building a moderately unremarkable business life in the Dallas area, he developed a vision. The vision was to own a professional hockey team. Not to invest in one, not to hold a minority stake, to own one. The problem was obvious. He did not have the money. What he had instead, and what the next several years would demonstrate in elaborate detail, was something that in the right circumstances could be made to look exactly like money. He had the appearance of money. He had a leased private plane. He had a spacious house in a wealthy Dallas suburb with, it would later emerge, a $1.9 million mortgage and $85,000 in unpaid back taxes. He had leased cars. He had friendships, or at least acquaintances, with famous names. Roger Staubach, the legendary Dallas Cowboys quarterback. Mario Lemieux, the Pittsburgh Penguins superstar. He had confidence. He had specificity about money, the specific, comfortable way of talking about large purchases that people who actually have money tend to have. And he had something else. He had a plan. The plan, according to what investigators and journalists later pieced together, was this. If he could create enough documentation to convince a bank to lend him enough money to initiate the purchase, he could then use the franchise itself, the asset he had just fraudulently acquired, as collateral to secure the additional financing he needed to actually complete the deal. He was going to buy a hockey team with borrowed money, and then use the hockey team to get more borrowed money to pay for the hockey team. The plan had one requirement. Nobody could look too closely at anything he was presenting as evidence of who he was. Before the Islanders, there were 2 other teams. The first was the Dallas Stars. In September of 1995, John Spano reached a tentative agreement to purchase a 50% interest in the Dallas Stars. The deal was pushed back, and pushed back again, and pushed back again. According to Fax Snippet's documentation, Stars owner Norman Green eventually described Spano as making what he called unreasonable demands. The deal collapsed. The second team was the Florida Panthers. Spano made overtures about purchasing the Panthers as well. That too went nowhere. But here's what those 2 failed attempts actually were. They were practice. Each attempt taught him something about how the process worked, what documents people asked for, what assurances satisfied them, where the gaps in verification existed that a confident and specific man with at least plain and famous friends could slip through. By the time he turned his attention to the New York Islanders in 1996, he was not a first-time fraudster improvising in real time. He was a man who had done 2 dry runs. The New York Islanders in 1996 were a franchise in distress. Those 4 consecutive Stanley Cups in the early 1980s, 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983, felt like ancient history by then. In the 8 seasons leading up to Spano's arrival, the team had missed the playoffs 5 times. Attendance at Nassau Coliseum was declining. The team's longtime owner, John Pickett, was in his 70s and had been trying to sell for years. He wanted out. He wanted someone to take this thing off his hands and restore it to something worthy of the history it carried. John Spano appeared at precisely the right moment. According to the Grokopedia documentation, NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman was the one who introduced Spano to Pickett, who brought him to the table, who validated him as a serious buyer worth considering. Think about what that means for a moment. Spano did not cold call the Islanders. He was brought in by the commissioner of the National Hockey League. Bettman's introduction was the first and most significant piece of legitimacy John Spano ever had. It was not something he manufactured, it was handed to him. Negotiations began. The number agreed upon was $165 million. Spano's stated net worth was $230 million. He claimed to own 10 different companies. He claimed to employ 6,000 people. He claimed to have received a substantial inheritance from a wealthy overseas relative, who, it was later noted by Texas Monthly, may or may not have been an Italian mobster. None of it was true. What he actually owned, the Bison Group and the Commercial Financial Group, were real companies. They were just significantly smaller than he had described. Much smaller. The kind of smaller that makes $165 million not just difficult, but operationally impossible. The kind of smaller that, if the NHL had looked, would have ended the conversation before it started. The NHL did look. They hired a former FBI agent to conduct a background check on the man they were about to approve as the new owner of one of their franchises. They paid him between $500 and $750. $500 to $750 for a background check on a man claiming to be worth $230 million, who was purchasing a $165 million asset. The former FBI agent found nothing to disqualify Spano. The NHL approved the sale. The documents that supported John Spano's claim to $230 million in net worth came in several forms and from several directions. A letter dated November 14, 1996, documented in the Dallas Observer's July 1997 investigation, was written by a man named Joseph Lynch, identified as a vice president at Comerica Bank in Texas. The letter stated that Spano maintained a net worth in excess of more than $100 million. Lynch later told federal investigators that the letter was based on 3 unverified documents he had received directly from Spano, not from an independent source. From Spano. Lynch verified Spano's wealth using documents Spano had provided to verify his own wealth. There were also documents purportedly from Lloyd's of London, the venerable British insurance institution, suggesting the existence of a substantial insurance-backed trust. When investigators contacted Lloyd's to verify the documents, Lloyd's of London reported it had no employee by the name of Clive Jones, the name on the documents. No employee, no record. The documents had been fabricated. Then there was Fleet Bank. Fleet Bank, based in Boston, was the institution that provided the $80 million loan that gave Spano enough money to actually initiate the purchase. Fleet Bank conducted verification of Spano's claimed assets. According to Lighthouse Hockey's detailed reconstruction of the case, Fleet did not see anything out of the ordinary with those verifications, and did no independent inspecting of its own. It handed Spano a check for $80 million. $80 million. Based on documents that Spano had either provided himself or fabricated outright. Later investigators would determine that several documents allegedly faxed from Comerica Bank had actually been sent from the fax machine at Spano's leasing office. They were admitted into evidence as clear forgeries, fabricated on a fax machine in a leasing office in Texas. And Fleet Bank handed him $80 million. In February 1997, John Pickett signed over the New York Islanders to John Spano. NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman called the sale a new era for the franchise. The Islanders' fan base, exhausted from years of losing, from missed playoffs, from the long shadow of those 4 championships that felt further away every season, welcomed Spano. He was their salvation. He was the man with the money and the vision and the willingness to invest in something that deserved better. John Spano assumed operational control of the franchise in April 1997. He incurred over $200,000 in expenses during his tenure as owner. He attended games at Nassau Coliseum. He held meetings with team management. He was, by all visible indicators, the owner of a professional hockey team. There were things that did not fit. His personality was described by people who spent time around him as dour and nervous, an unusual quality in a man supposedly worth $230 million who had just completed the purchase of his dreams. He was known to ask media members for tickets to games, a request that struck people as strange coming from the owner of the building they were in. He let various creditors go unpaid for extended periods. But these were small things, the kind of things that can be explained away in 100 different ways when you want to believe in the person standing in front of you. And Long Island wanted to believe. They had been waiting for someone like this for years. Meanwhile, somewhere in Pittsburgh, Mario Lemieux, the Penguin superstar, the man Spano had described as his friend, had made a loan to Spano for $1 million. Spano had taken that $1 million and used it to pay the operating expenses of the Islanders, the player payroll, the day-to-day bills of running the franchise. According to the documented account from the podcast that interviewed Newsday reporter John Valenti, Mario Lemieux was playing against the New York Islanders while unknowingly paying the salaries of the players he was competing against. He did not know this. Nobody had told him that his $1 million had become the Islanders' payroll. That is how far this had gone. The system Spano had built required one thing above all others to keep functioning. Payments had to keep arriving. Not the full amount, not yet, but enough to keep the process moving, to keep Pickett from looking too carefully at what was actually there, to keep the franchise operating while he worked out how to use the franchise itself to secure the money he still did not have. The payments did not keep arriving. According to KSL's documentation of the case, the fraud began to crack when Spano failed to pay a relatively modest payment, $5 million, that was due to the previous ownership. In the context of a $165 million deal, $5 million is not a catastrophic shortfall. It is the kind of thing that might have an explanation: a wire transfer that was delayed, a bank process that was slower than expected. Spano had explanations. He had blamed incorrectly placed decimal points on earlier payment shortfalls. He had provided promissory notes. He had bought time with language and confidence at every prior moment where the numbers had not aligned with what was expected. But by June 1997, the explanations had accumulated into a pattern that no longer had a benign reading. The payments were not coming. They had never been coming. There was no money behind them. NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman had reached his limit. He gave Spano an ultimatum. 1 week. Prove you have the money. Show us something real. To prove to Bettman that the money existed, Spano faxed the NHL and Pickett a letter from Comerica Bank, signed, apparently, by Joseph Lynch, the vice president whose name had appeared on the earlier net worth verification letter. The letter was faxed from Spano's office. Investigators later confirmed it was a forgery. The 1-week deadline passed. On June 24, 1997, 58 days after he had assumed operational control of the New York Islanders, John Spano resigned as owner. He had been the owner of an NHL franchise for 58 days. His bank account at the time of his arrest contained less than $100,000. He had financed the purchase of a $165 million asset almost entirely with forged documents, borrowed money, and the structural inertia of institutions that wanted the deal to be real almost as much as he did. After his resignation on June 24th, John Spano did not stay in New York. He went to the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands are a British overseas territory in the Caribbean, one of the most well-known offshore financial jurisdictions in the world. Whether he went there to access money that was actually there, or to find money that was not, or simply to be somewhere other than the United States while the investigation began to gather momentum, the documented record does not specify. What it does specify is this. On July 23, 1997, when John Spano returned to New York from the Cayman Islands, federal agents were waiting for him. he was arrested at the airport. He was arraigned on federal charges of bank fraud, wire fraud, and forgery across New York, Massachusetts, and Texas. The charges covered the Fleet Bank loan, the Comerica documents, the forged Lloyds of London papers, and the broader scheme to fraudulently acquire control of the New York Islanders. He was 32 years old. When investigators went through the actual picture of John Spano's finances, what they found was a construction so thin it is difficult to understand how it had held together for as long as it did. The house in the wealthy Dallas suburb, the one that signaled wealth and stability, had a mortgage of $1.9 million and $85,000 in back taxes and penalties. The private plane was leased. The cars were leased. The trust fund his bio referenced did not exist. The inheritance did not exist. The wealthy overseas relative did not exist. The 10 companies employing 6,000 people, his actual business operations, were real, but orders of magnitude smaller than described. The money he claimed to have in accounts at Comerica Bank was not there. The money he claimed to have inherited from overseas was not anywhere. According to the documented case records, he owed significant sums to people he had described as friends, including $1.25 million to Mario Lemieux and undisclosed amounts to Roger Staubach. The man who had sat in NHL boardrooms, who had been introduced by the commissioner himself, who had controlled a franchise for 58 days, had done all of it with less than $100,000 in his name and a collection of documents fabricated on office equipment. John Spano pleaded guilty to the charges against him. In 1999, he was sentenced to 71 months in federal prison, just under 6 years, and ordered to pay $11.9 million in restitution. That restitution included $1.25 million to Mario Lemieux for the $1 million he had loaned Spano, that Spano had used to pay the Islanders' player salaries while those same players were competing against Lemieux's team. It included restitution to Roger Staubach. It included restitution to the Islanders themselves. John Pickett, having regained control of the franchise he had wanted to sell, negotiated with Fleet Bank to manage the $80 million loan Spano had secured. He then went looking for another buyer. John Spano was released from prison in August of 2004. 6 months later, in February of 2005, he was arrested again, this time in Ohio, for defrauding businesses out of money they had paid him to arrange loans and lease equipment. He was convicted. He served 51 months. He was released in 2009. In 2014, he was arrested again, Ohio, 16 counts of forgery. In 2015, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was held at the Grafton Correctional Institution in Ohio. He was released in November of 2024. 3 separate prison sentences, 3 separate fraud convictions, combined fines and restitution exceeding $12 million. The first sentence was for buying a hockey team with forged documents, the second for defrauding businesses out of equipment loan payments, the third for forgery. The pattern across nearly 30 years is a man who never stopped doing what he had always done, creating paper, presenting it as real, and waiting to see how far it would take him. What I keep returning to in this case is not the forgeries, not the Lloyds of London letter with the name of an employee who did not exist, not the fax sent from Spano's own leasing office that was supposed to appear as a letter from a bank, not even the $80 million that Fleet handed over based on documents they did not verify. What I keep returning to is the $500 to $750. That is what the NHL paid to investigate the man they were about to approve as the owner of one of their franchises. $500. On the high end, $750. For a background check on a 32-year-old claiming to be worth $230 million, who wanted to buy a $165 million asset that employed hundreds of people and represented the sporting identity of an entire region. $500. The Dallas Observer's 1997 investigation and John Valenti's Newsday reporting both documented the staggering lack of due diligence done on Spano's background and finances. The NHL wanted the deal to close. John Pickett wanted to sell. Fleet Bank wanted to make the loan. Everyone in the room had a reason to want what Spano was presenting to be exactly what he said it was. And when everyone in the room wants something to be real, wants it enough to spend $500 on a background check for a $165 million transaction, A man with a leased plane and forged documents and the specific comfortable way of talking about money that people who actually have money tend to have, can walk through a door that should never have been open. He controlled the New York Islanders for 58 days. He owed Mario Lemieux $1.25 million. He had less than $100,000. And the league that let him in paid $500 to make sure he was who he said he was.